again to come before you. Please speak to us through the book of Genesis. Continue to work in our hearts, to shape us and mold us, to grow us in the grace and knowledge of you. Please do my prayer. Amen. Any questions about Hagar, Sarah, Galatians 4, etc., etc., etc.? All right. Any questions about the projector?
I thought it was supposed to be green screen, not blue screen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if it was green screen and I was taller, they could put a nice background behind me. But, no. It's funny because we just at the last meeting said, let's set aside some money to replace that computer. And then this happened. So we must have had a pretty good premonition or something. Or maybe they changed something and that's what happened. I don't know. But I guess Lake moved around behind me and all kinds of stuff I wasn't aware of, and what I was aware of was distracting. But I appreciate everybody who raced around to figure it out. And we had PowerPoint for the last song, or we had the projector. So if there's a time for it to go out, the sermons immediately leaves. You guys are so into the sermons that it wasn't distracting. Anyway. True. My two best Noah jokes. These are really bad. Unfortunately, it's not really good ones. Do you need to build a boat? Because I know a guy. He's an architect. That was not too bad. Did you know that Noah was a great financier? He was floating his stock while everyone else was in liquidation. All right, bye. So there's some for next week. We are in Genesis 7, and we are making our way through. And what we talked about last week was whether or not this is a real story. And first of all, it's in Scripture, so I think we have to take it as true. And I don't think this could be put into the genre of parable. I don't think you can understand, especially the way it's addressed in the New Testament, which we'll get to later, and the fact that Genesis presents itself over and over again as history. And so I think we have to treat these passages as history. And so that causes a lot of problem for a lot of people because conventional opinion of science right now is that there wasn't a global flood, that the universe is I think now they say 12 billion years old. I know there's still some debate there. I think they say the Earth is 4.5. I don't remember. It's been a while since I looked. But there's debate about that. Billions of years. So I'm just going to say again at the beginning of this one, I believe you can be a Christian and believe that the Earth is billions of years old. I don't think that's the best way to understand Genesis, and what I want to present to you guys through this is some of the evidence that maybe that isn't the case. When I read Genesis, I see evidence that is different than conventional science. So we looked at last week, we looked at the size of the ark and the number of animals, and we kind of worked through that. Genesis 7, verse 17, we're going to start into sort of the question of, was this a global or a local flood? Right? Anybody ever been through a local flood? Sarah and I, middle of the night, crowd of Louisiana. I woke up during a storm, which didn't usually happen back then, but I woke up during the storm, looked outside, and there was water all over the yard, and I watched it for 30 minutes. I said, we're getting out of here. I put the family in the car, and when I started the car, it coughed because there was already water coming up to the car. It coughed when it started. And we pulled one vehicle up by the railroad tracks where it was higher, got the rest of the family in the car, drove them to meet with our friends, and he drove his truck through the water to take most of my family to their house, which was on a hill. And I drove back to our house, waded through the water, and watched our house through the night. And people had laughed at us because we built our house up on a path floods are scary things. But that was just a local flood and did all kinds of damage. And God did some really cool things for us during that. It's all that water in our area drained into another area. And so actually as the water went down in our area, the rest of Crowley was flooding. And it was as bad as a flood that happened 75 years ago. And I was standing next to a police officer, or no, a firefighter, as they're bringing boats of people out of a neighborhood. And I was waiting there to pick somebody up and give them a ride. And I'm standing next to this firefighter, and he's angrily talking into his radio, and he says, Lafayette has a flood shelter. They have a flood shelter over here. Where are we supposed to take people? How come Crowley doesn't have a flood shelter? And I tapped him on the shoulder, and I said, hey, just down there, Forest Park Church of Christ, I said, I'm going to go unlock the fellowship hall. We'll make a shelter by tonight. Just bring people there. And the fire department said, hey, we're setting up a shelter at the Church of Christ. And they dropped off cots for us. And we had some people in the church cook meals. And mostly what we ended up being was a drop off and pick up place, but we had some people who stayed there all night long. And it was just a last minute thing. And then I forget, the next day the government shut us down. Said we, because we didn't meet the requirements for a shelter, I guess. So it was better for the people around the shelter than, but the day we needed it,
Well,
the day,
but we still were a relief distribution center after that. We just couldn't host people overnight.
right. Anyway, God did stuff through that was kind of cool. But that was just a local flood, caused all kinds of devastation all over down there. The Bible seems to indicate that this is a global flood. But some people read this passage and they say, look, this story is just talking about a local flood, not a global flood. So, I just want to point out, it looks like the text here goes out of its way to repeatedly say in multiple different ways that the flood was global and covered the whole world. So let's look through this and we'll see what you see. Genesis 17:17, the beginning of that verse says, the flood continued for 40 days on the earth. This is a 40-day rain. There's an old phrase, rain by 7, quit by, I don't know, where's this person in this room? Quit by 11. Bonnie remembers.
Jill had it too. She just was quiet.
Okay, yes. Rain by 7, quit by 11. Right? Generally, that's true. If it rains by 7, it quits by 11. 4 hours is a good. This is 40 days of rain. That's a lot of water. Okay? The rest of this, verse 17. The waters increased and bore up the ark and rose high above the earth. The earth just means the ground. Could still be local. But it says the water was high above the earth. It was enough to raise up this ark. Alright? So, rained for a long time, the ark was lifted high off the ground. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the water. The water prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heavens, the sky, were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covered them 15 cubits deep. Alright? 15 cubits, a cubit's 18 inches, so that's like 22 and a half feet, right? 22 and a half feet above the mountains. Now, I'll just tell you, this would work if you were talking about Blueberry Hill up in northern Minnesota. Northern Minnesota is super flat. Close to where I grew up, there was a sign for Blueberry Hill. And we always laugh when we passed Blueberry Hill because you couldn't tell it was a hill if there wasn't a sign. It should be more like Blueberry Rise or something. You know? It was just so gradual going up Blueberry Hill and then down. If there wasn't a sign, nobody knew it was a hill. And so they had a sign there, Blueberry Hill. If it was like that, that's not very impressive. But around Israel, certainly around Mount Ararat, the areas where the Bible is from, there are really high hills, mountains. Okay? And if the highest one of those mountains was covered and then past that, it It doesn't say that the mountains are covered, and then you can say, well, it meant mostly covered. No, it says from the highest point, 20-some feet. 20 feet over the highest point. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, swarming creatures that swam on the earth, and all mankind, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, creeping things, birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. Rained for a long time. The ark was lifted out of the ground. It was 20 feet over the highest point. Everything that was not on the ark died. Now, and I just want to ask you this question. If it was local, then why didn't God just say, Noah,
take the next 100 years. God speaks in a much louder voice. Noah, take the next 100 years and make your way out of Canaan or out of wherever he was. We don't know for sure. Make your way out of wherever you are and wait there. And then come back when the flood's over. That would be easier than building an ark, especially if you had 100 years to do it. And we talked about how big the ark was, right? Don't gather all these animals. Just push them out of the area and bring them back with you when you come. That would be easier. Do a big cattle drive of animals, big animal drive, and bring them back. You got 100 years to do that. That's not what God said. He said, build this huge ark, and everything that's not on the ark will die. It says that the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So it rained for 40 days, and then for the next 150 days, the water stayed on the earth. A local flood, it does not take 150 days to drain water off a local flood. I think that this can only be interpreted honestly as a global flood. I don't think there's a way around the claims that the entire earth was, the fact that the entire earth was covered by a flood in which only 8 people and a large boat full of animals survived. The question is then, is there evidence for such a global catastrophe happened? That's the question, right? And what I want to give you is 2 lines of evidence and some agreed upon facts. And then I want to examine them and show you how, looking at things through a Bible lens, you can look at the same evidence in a completely different way. All right? The first one is plate tectonics. The Bible said that when the water, at the end of the flood, God raises up mountains and lowers down valleys, giving spaces for the water to drain off, right? And it says that God divides the land in the days of Peleg, okay? An agreed upon fact. Almost everybody in the scientific community, this is what's taught in school, is that originally the continents were one big continent. All right? If you look at a map of the world, you see how these 2 things look like they could push together and fit together. And this is crazy, but what's agreed upon in science is that originally these were pushed together and were one continent. And if you look down the center, there's a bump that goes down the middle of that like a zipper, and it actually goes around and up here and through here. But that zipper that goes down the middle is called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And these continents fit right up against that Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And the belief is that Mid-Atlantic Ridge is where the continents originally sat together, and then they were pulled apart. Now, what most people in the scientific community believe is that happened slowly. The continent slowly drifted apart. But if you go down here and you look at the trenches and things that are formed around here, it literally looks like they were drug apart rapidly, creating these huge, gigantic grooves right off this mid-Atlantic ridge. Not only that, the mid-Atlantic ridge is pointed up. Leaves that big up right there. In fact, it looks like, if you look at the mid-Atlantic ridge, it looks like something underneath burst out of it. Well, the one thing the Bible says is not just that rain came down, but it says the fountains of the deep sprang forth and water came up out of the ground. And so one theory with the flood is that down below the surface of the ground, just like there is today, but more so, that there was water left below, and God allowed that to burst forth, and water sprayed out of that, and that water underneath the continents allowed for that to spread out. I don't know if that's how it happened, but there's general agreement with everybody that originally there were one continent. Most people agree that there are sediment layers all over the world. If you go look at almost any geological formation, anybody ever been to the Grand Canyon or Whitewater? You can look around and you can see how there's layers in the rock. It's one color, then it goes to another color, then it goes to another color. Well, that's evidence of rapidly deposited sediment. If you take something and you slowly change the sediment that's there, the colors fade slowly. But if you rapidly put something down, you can shake things into different colors. A great experiment you can do is to take a giant pickle jar. I've done this many times. You take one of those huge pickle jars, like one of the big ones, like the Sam's Club huge pickle jar, and you take a scoop of clay and a scoop of sand and a scoop of black dirt, and you put it in there and you fill it about a third of the way, and then you fill the rest with water. You take that and you shake it, and you set it down. What happens is that dirt will divide itself into layers. It will just automatically split itself into layers. By the way, the geological formations even around us split off into layers. You see you go up and down the Mississippi, there's all these places where there's flat-topped hills. You take the drive from Winona up to Red Wing, and along there you'll see these hills that come up to a certain level and then they flatten off, and then there's gouges between them. That's large level flood geology. Sometimes people interpret it as glaciers, but we got all these layers around there. It's interesting because some of these layers, if you take them and you allow them the time to turn into rock, and then you take a rock and you bend it, what happens when you bend a rock? It breaks. However, there's a number of cases where these layers are bent. Or there's even a few cases where the layers were flipped. And so you have a layer that goes like this. Now, if you take ground when it's wet and then you move it, as the waters are moving back and forth, you can flip ground like that rapidly. But you can't have slow sediment dry and harden into rock and then flip it. That doesn't work. Not only that, there's stark layers. There's clear lines. You can take pictures of it. You can look, here's a layer and here's a layer. There's also layers that are transcontinental. In other words, they can look at some of the layers in the United States and find corresponding layers on continents on the other side of the world. So that's pretty huge that the same geological formations would be happening in other parts of the world. And then there's this is a phrase called polystrata fossils. A fossil is usually formed when something's covered up rapidly and turned into rock through that process, or the ground around it turns to rock and leaves a gap in that shape. It either happens that the thing itself turns into rock, or that the gap around it turns into rock. A polystrata fossil is a fossil that goes through multiple layers. They found trees that are pointed up through multiple layers of strata. If those layers are millions of years old, if it took millions of years to fall, then how was a tree standing there long enough for those layers to form? There's a bunch of polystrata fossils. There's even places where it appears that animals were fossilized between two layers. If you take, there's another experiment that you can do that we did in science when I was a kid. Had nothing to do with creation or anything, but we poured different liquids into a jar of different densities, like milk and vegetable oil and water, and it all splits itself into layers. Some don't because they're similar densities, and then you drop objects in them, and the objects will go down to a layer that's the right density and they'll stop. So if you drop a bunch of nuts in of the same size, they'll all go down to one layer and they'll stop. You drop something else, it'll go down to the other layer and stop. So it'll also split things into layers that way. Anyway, polystrata fossils. Most people agree there's all of these layers. Then there's fossils buried everywhere. Fossils happen when something's rapidly buried and has then the long opportunity to be changed into rock. The fact that there are fossils all over the world means that at some point there were either volcano eruptions or flooding all over the world. All of these seem to happen at the same time in history, whether or not you believe in a young Earth or you follow the current scientific opinion. In science today, they talk about the Cambrian explosion, which is a period in history where tons of stuff got fossilized. All of these different things are all in around the same layer. And it's remarkable because suddenly all around the world you have this explosion of this one time period worth of fossil. That means there was rapid burial all over. They are finding increasing evidence that these fossils are younger than they thought it would be. In my lifetime, they have found dinosaur tissue that they could actually grab with tweezers, and it's flexible. It's still elastic. I'm just saying, how would that be if that's millions of years old? Can we honestly believe that millions of years would not have fossilized, would have left it elastic? That seems pretty incredible to me. There are fossils of marine animals on top of mountains. Fish fossils on top of mountains. Everybody agrees that plate tectonics was probably the reason that they're there. The mountains were pushed up at one time. But that seems pretty startling if that's the only solution to the problem, that most of the major mountains around the world would have. Like, isn't that a coincidence that you've got marine fossils on top of all these mountains? Seems like that would be evidence. Not only that, fossilized animals are deposited oftentimes in what they call fossil graveyards, where a ton are dumped into one place. This happens in flooding. If you have a flood, animals die in the flood, and then them and the plants are swept into one area where the water drains to and congregates and gathers all that stuff together. Flooding does that. Natural death does not do that. In fact, there's tons of cases where you have a bunch of animals that normally wouldn't associate together, but they've all been dumped in a heap and fossilized all over. And then we now know it does not take millions of years to create a fossil. You can create a fossil if you know the right process and you apply the right pressure and you use the right type of ground. You can create your own fossil. And Mount St. Helens, when it ruptured, created fossils. A lot of fossils are found in coal beds. Coal is created from buried plants, large layers under huge sections of ground where evidently a bunch of vegetation was rapidly buried under dirt and then formed into fossil coal beds. Everybody agrees on that. What's the best explanation? Is it that there was a globalized flood that rapidly buried a bunch of stuff? Or is it that that slowly happened over millions of years? Not only that, but frozen in the ice. There are these places where muddy ice was formed that rapidly buried things that has stayed frozen until this day. And so there are places where ice is melting on the planet right now that have mammoths preserved in them. Mammoths, I forget how long ago they said mammoths were around, but people in the last 100 years have eaten mammoth steaks. I wouldn't recommend it, but found mammoths. These mammoths are remarkably well preserved. There's a baby mammoth that they found, and it looks like it just went to sleep when they found it. Being exposed in a museum has not helped it. But they found these. By the way, they say that these were alive during the Ice Age. Now science is moving away from that because we know how much food it takes to most animals that live in Arctic areas are smaller because they have less food. That's why the deer in northern Russia are smaller than the deer we have in Minnesota, because there's less food to feed them. You wouldn't have elephants surviving even if they had a ton of not wool but hair on them. Wool is a misnomer. It wouldn't be enough to help them to survive, and it wouldn't explain why mammoths are sometimes found with warm weather plants in their stomachs. So wherever they were buried, it was a ton of water and a dramatic climactic change that covered them up really quickly. Sounds to me like a global flood could do that really easy. Yeah. So let me just go through these. Sedimentary layers. There's layers of sediment all over the world. If you take a non-biblical view, you can say those were laid down slowly over time. If you take a biblical view, you could say those were laid down quickly by a worldwide flood. There's abundant fossils. Many fossils buried in rock layers all over the world. If you take a non-biblical view, you could say those slowly formed over time. If you take a biblical view, you can say those formed rapidly through the flood. And that explains we had a global flood. That's why you find them all over, even on mountaintops. There's wide agreement that there was mass extinction on our planet at several times throughout its history. The majority of known animal species are now extinct. You say, well, if every kind of animal was on the ark, why didn't they all survive? Some animals probably didn't live as many generations after that, weren't able to rebuild their population, whatever. But you could say that if you have a non-biblical view, you could say that mass extinction happened in various events that killed off species. If you take the biblical view, you could say pretty much the same thing, but that those populations were narrowed down by the flood. Mountaintop fossils. There's marine fossils on the top of mountains all over the world. If you take a non-biblical view, you could say that the plates of the continent slowly pushed those up, which I believe that's how mountains were formed, but that's how those fossils ended up on top of mountains. If you take a biblical view, you could say that although the mountains were formed by plate tectonics, they were once covered by water, and that's why you find fossils up there. Now, the water wouldn't have to be deep enough to be over the top of Mount Everest, right? Because the Bible says the mountains rose up. But it covered mountains, it says in the Bible. Plate tectonics. The surface of the globe was divided into tectonic plates, these continents and things that move around. Those rubbing up against each other is what causes earthquakes and mountains and valleys and things. And if you take a non-biblical view, you could say that over millions of years, the land divided into our present continents like we have today, that happened over a period of time over millions of years. If you take a biblical view, you could say that that the continents were ripped apart rapidly around the time of the flood. We have shaped topography. Our landscape was shaped by water, glaciers, and tectonic plates. If you take a non-biblical view, you could say that happened with many events slowly over time. If you take a biblical view, you could say it was mostly one rapid worldwide flood. Have you ever been to the Grand Canyon? The Grand Canyon supposedly happened really slowly through water coming through there slowly over millions and millions of years forming it. I'll just tell you, if you take a hose and you put it on a ridge of mud, it splashes out and makes the same sort of patterns that are on the Grand Canyon. I'm not saying that that's necessarily how it happened, but to me, I look at the Grand Canyon, that looks like rapid water movement before this is solidified to me, and that's why it has the layers with the burst through it. By the way, there are scientists today who do think that the Grand Canyon formed rapidly, but they say there was once this huge lake over the center of the United States, and that's what caused all those fossils there. There was a huge flooding event. It wasn't global, but it was most of the North American continent, or a lot of it, and that burst forth and formed the Grand Canyon. There are scientists today who say it could have happened quickly, but it couldn't have been a global flood. But it could have happened quickly. Or millions of years. Dinosaurs. Everybody agrees. Our world was once inhabited by giant reptiles. Dinosaurs lived, if you take a non-biblical view, you can say dinosaurs lived and went extinct long before humans. If you take a biblical view, you could say dinosaurs lived at the same time as humans and were probably on the ark. Anybody know the average size of a dinosaur? Yeah. That's the average size of an animal on the planet. The average size of a dinosaur is actually smaller than the average size of animals. The average dinosaur is about the size of a chicken. That's the reason is because there's a whole lot smaller ones. There's a whole lot more smaller ones, but the ones that make it in the museum are the big ones. Because what do you want to see? Do you want to see a dinosaur the size of a chicken, or do you want to see a huge dinosaur that fills you want to see the huge ones? And so that's the ones they have at the museum. But the average size of a dinosaur, they think, was somewhere around the size of a chicken. Now, the reason dinosaurs got so big is because they could grow. Reptiles grow for a really long time, right? Well, here's a question. If, as the Bible indicates, before the flood things were living longer, then you would expect things that grow their whole lifespan to be bigger, right? What are some reptiles we have around today? Crocodile. Crocodiles and alligators, turtles, snakes. Here's a fun thing to Google. Did you know that for each one of those, there was a dinosaur form that was huge? There were giant alligator crocodile things the size of a bus. There were snakes that were monstrously big. There were turtles the size of Volkswagen bugs. Tortoises, actually. Tortoises the size of Volkswagen bugs. Could it be that we have dinosaurs alive today? They just don't live as long? Most people, all dinosaur means, by the way, is the name came from giant lizard. If things used to live longer, that would explain why there were big ones, and it would also explain why maybe they didn't get as big as the flood. If you look at dinosaurs, people originally, when they saw pictures of dinosaur fossils, they said, boy, these are ancient dragons. And a lot of legends have evidence in fact. Most cultures around the world have dragon legends. I don't think they necessarily breathe fire, but most legends don't actually say anything about fire. It just says that there were these exploits where people went and fought and killed these giant lizard things. It's fascinating to me because what would have happened that could have made dinosaurs go extinct? Well, the reason wolves originally went extinct in Minnesota was because we didn't like them killing our sheep. I don't think you'd want dinosaurs around you if you had a herd of something. I think the legends of people going and fighting and killing dinosaurs or dragons might have been people going and killing dinosaurs. In Mexico, they have rocks that are carved in the shape of dinosaurs that predate this. They're cave wall drawings of brontosaurus or apatosaurus shaped animals. In China, they have legends and sculptures of big giant reptiles. Marco Polo claimed to have seen dragons that were kept in the court of the Khan. There's a massive historical record that could support the claim that in ancient times there were dinosaurs alive with people. I know that rocks your worldview, but if that's not the case, then you have to explain why the legends are so similar to the creatures you dig up. Why are the animals we dig up, why do they look so much like the pictures that people made up? And so now some people have the theory that in ancient times, people dug up dinosaur fossils and made legends about them. Well, here's what you need to know about fossils. Most of the time, you do not find a giant, complete fossil, especially big ones. You find all kinds of little bones, and then you have to figure out how to put them together. It takes years and years and years and years to put together a huge dinosaur bone fossil. Anyway, they say that they'll say, well, you can cut open a dinosaur bone. Clarence gave me a dinosaur bone. It's not a very impressive one, but it was from something big. This is only the end of it, right? It's kind of cool because on this one, this is like a joint. You can see some of the webbing that's inside of a bone. It's fossilized and stuff. There's tons of dinosaur species, but this guy who owned his own museum was like, why are there 3 different kinds of triceratops? And he's like, well, I have my own bones, dinosaur bones, and I have my own saw. So he did what people rarely do, and he cut open some dinosaur bones. And he looked at the webbing in there, and you can tell how old something is by how dense its bones are, and your bones age over time. They get more dense, and then they get more brittle, I think is what happens. So he took, and he lined up, and he said, why are these things that look like triceratops, but they don't have as many horns? And why are there these big ones that have all these horns? And what he concluded was actually there was probably just one kind of triceratops, and when they're little, they don't have horns, and as they grow, they get more horns, and it turns out the big ones have more dense bones and the small ones don't. Anyway, that's still hotly debated. But if you can cut open a dinosaur bone, wouldn't you expect there to be evidence that it was super old? Well, I think not. If things were aging slower, I would assume their bones would densify slower, and I don't think that would be an accurate way to tell the difference. But anyway, if you take a non-biblical view, you could say the dinosaurs lived and went extinct before humans. If you took a biblical view, you could say the dinosaurs lived at the same time as humans and were probably on the ark. By the way, when we talked about the size of the ark last week, the number of animals we said needed to be on the ark included dinosaurs. By the way, you wouldn't need to bring a big apatosaurus. You could bring a baby apatosaurus. And if you brought baby animals, you'd need a whole lot less space than what we had. And I'm just telling you, if I had the choice between bringing a bull and bringing a calf, I would bring a calf. Eats less, easier to lead around. That would be what I would do. That would be the sensical thing. And so I don't think we have to assume that there was a full-grown pair of elephants when there could have been 2 baby elephants. I don't think we had to have to assume that there'd be a full-grown dinosaur when there could have been baby dinosaurs. Could have been eggs. I don't know what they would have done. Maybe that's what a lot of Noah did in the 150 days, was sitting on the dinosaur eggs. I don't know. Somehow I don't think that's the case. But here's one. Flood myths. Everybody who studies ancient history is well aware of the fact that there are flood stories with striking similarities all over the world. King Ambargasi of Syria, he claimed to have read texts from, he bragged about his library a lot. He had a great library. He said, I even have texts from before the flood. He said, I have texts that are from before the flood in my library. I would imagine if you were creating an ark to preserve things, you would probably bring some texts on it. I would think that'd be one of the things that Noah gathered and put on the ark. If not, the fact that some of them were stone and clay would mean that some of them would have survived the ark to be found and gathered into Ambargasi's. But you go into ancient China. Ancient Chinese believed that one of their most famous legends was that people lived for thousands of years, long lifespans, and then there was a global flood, and they survived it. And then the Chinese Empire was formed afterward. Native American tribes, they had legends of a global flood. Most of them have, one of the things that a lot of them have in common is a guy and his wife who gather animals onto a raft or something like that and rescue them. It's interesting that the older the legends are, the more similar they are to Genesis. I don't know if you have a favorite curator of the British Museum, but my favorite curator of the British Museum is Irving Finkel. Irving Finkel translates cuneiform tablets, and he's got a cool beard. And Irving Finkel has translated numerous flood tablets. One of the last ones that he translated in the last decade actually has the phrase 2 by 2 in it when it talks about animals getting on. It's an Assyrian legend of a flood. You can read the Gilgamesh epic. You can read all these different. Anyway, legends all over the world of a worldwide flood where animals were rescued. Now, which sounds more sensible? People all over the world came up with the same legend? Or that thousands of years ago when people went to these continents, they carried a legend with them that was a similar legend? Or that maybe around 5,000 years ago, a group of people whose ancestors actually did survive the flood carried that story with them as they spread out over the world. We have the same set of facts. It's how you interpret them and understand them in the light of Scripture that's different. Did you know that they've now determined that every single human being on the planet shares at least 2 common ancestors? They call them mitochondrial Adam and mitochondrial Eve. And although they say that the mitochondrial Adam and mitochondrial Eve are millions of years ago or a long time ago, every time they make a new discovery, it gets just a little bit closer. Everybody in the world should at least have the DNA of Adam and should at least have the DNA of Noah and his wife in them. Other DNA as well, right? From the wives of Noah's sons, but we should share that common DNA. Anyway, there's all of this evidence. The question is, how are you going to interpret and understand this evidence? You know what the number one kind of fossil is? Marine life. Shells and things like that. Okay. Long and short of it is, I'm not a scientist, and I'm not an expert in any of that. But it seems to me there's 2 ways of interpreting the evidence, and you can at least give the Bible the benefit of the doubt. You can at least say, look, the Bible's going to call this history, and I'm going to keep an open mind about it. I think there's evidence. I believe that the flood was global. I haven't seen anything to contradict that. Oh, let me tell you this one. Ken Ham did this debate against Bill Nye, the science guy. I know a lot of people watch that debate. I wasn't that impressed with Ken Ham's dealing with it, and I think the reason was that I really like Ken Ham, but I think he focused more on the theology and didn't answer some of the science that I wanted him to do. But I made a list of everything that Bill Nye, the science guy, when I listened to it, I wrote down everything he said that I was like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. And the only real one that stumped me was Bill Nye, the science guy, said, okay, the flood should have happened 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. We have trees that are like 9,000 years old. Boom. Defeated. I was like, boy, that is a problem. Now, plants can survive through floods. In fact, it's remarkable what can bounce back after 150 days submerged by water. But that was a problem for me. And so I went up and I looked through a list of the oldest trees on the planet. And because I was like, I want to know, and I'm not the kind of person who's like, okay, Bill Nye, I'm not going to believe Genesis anymore. So I'm like, okay, what are the actual, and I looked up the oldest trees on the planet. And what's the normal way you count how old a tree is? You count the rings, right? The oldest trees on the planet were not determined, their age wasn't determined by their rings. In fact, you count the rings on the oldest trees on our planet, guess what? There's a whole bunch of them that are 4,500 years old. The oldest planet by counting rings, the oldest trees, all date back to about the same time, the time of the flood. There was a whole bunch of trees that started their lifespan right around the time that the flood ended. However, if you carbon date the roots of some of those trees, the carbon dating puts those trees as older. And so what they say is, those trees were actually older, the roots were older, the top was destroyed, the tree kept growing, and so while the top is only this old, the tree itself is older. Go read it up. If you find anything that contradicts that, I want to read it and I want to look at it. But at the time that that debate happened, I was super disappointed because that was misleading. All right, that class is done. The kids' classes are done. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for a chance to come before you. I pray that we just look at your word with an open mind. You're the only one who was there. And I pray that you'd help us to see the evidence clearly and follow it where it leads. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Dismissed, but I'd love to talk about it more if anybody wants to, but